And feel free to email them through if you haven't already done so. David, first question to you. You believe that the Fair Insurance Code has landed in the right spot, but perhaps could it or should it have gone further given the opportunity that was provided here?
No, I'm not inclined to say that that it's obvious to me that it should have gone further. I mean, perhaps I guess most people here would appreciate this, but partly I say that because it went through a process. The draft was produced together with an accompanying report, identifying issues and explaining the draft. Organisations were specifically invited to respond, and other people had the opportunity to respond. There wasn't an overwhelming number of responses, but organisations like the Consumer Council, we heard from this morning, were included, government as well, and those responses were then responded to in turn in terms of the final draft. I think that's a good process. Mm-hmm. But to me, I'm going to come back to the point I was trying to make earlier. I think it would be a big mistake to see this code as though it stands on its own. It's trying to carry all the weight of all the, either the restoration of public trust on the one hand or setting out all the obligations on the other. This sits in the middle of a spectrum, and in that extent does an important but limited job. I think in those terms it does it well.
So in terms of some of the points that Samson just made, and you made it pointedly at the end about the customer engagement factor, how much more do you think the industry needs to sort of step up to meet that benchmark, that challenge that you said?
I think there's two different things going on here. I think there's Christchurch, what's still happening down there, and the lessons we might learn from it, and then there's either perhaps more normal times or hopefully how we might do better in a similar set of challenges. Part of the challenge of a code is it is trying to avoid contractual commitments. It's setting out a set of principles or undertakings which the industry is prepared to be held to, so it's not like there's no recourse, but this is not the level of detail you would expect in the contract, and it is not the level of obligation you would expect in statute, law or regulation. It sits somewhere in the middle. So when you read a principle like, we will stay in touch, we will do our best to be, to communicate with you every 20 days or so on, I think that's couched in the right kind of level. You can stand back and say, well, did that happen? It's not like it's got no meaning at all. Like, I can't tell afterwards whether it was honoured or not. But it's, I think if people take that seriously, and I think this has been a serious exercise at the industry, this isn't flim-flam or, if people take that seriously, they go away as individual firms and say, well, what do I need to do to honour that commitment if I'm put to it, then the standard of performance will be seen to be better.
You mentioned a couple of different styles of regulation. You talked about light-handed regulation. Actually, I haven't heard that term used for a long time, actually, but we all remember it from the 80s and 90s. And then you talked about self-regulation.
Yes.
And I wondered if there isn't, in fact, a third category, which is self-serving regulation.
Well, it might be.
Which is the kind of the public perception of what self-regulation might be.
Let me answer in this way. One of the questions that I asked myself at the beginning of this exercise was, who's the customer? That is to say, is this a product, the code, being produced for the end consumers as customers? They're going to read it, they're going to use it, so the answer is at least in part yes. But to what extent is the industry the customer? To what extent is this document being produced for the industry's use, to respond to the industry's needs? And I came to the conclusion that there was probably a fair bit of that, but that was okay. That didn't mean the exercise was self-serving in a cynical sense. The industry has a legitimate need for a product, a device, a mechanism that could, in accessible language, set out for the end customers a set of undertakings, a set of principles that the industry was prepared to honour. There's a benefit there for the industry, there's a benefit there for end consumers. Maybe quite useful to recognise both.
Samson, I'll pick up from your point of view. It's not often an industry gets an opportunity to experience something on the scale of the earthquake, which then creates a whole lot of checks and balances that it can go through. And you touched on some of those in your presentation. But what for you has been the big takeaway that the sector really needs to consider more from here?
Well, drawing on the point that David made earlier, that customer community stakeholder engagement is vital, and you've got to be talking to people regularly and often, sometimes repeating yourself, because at different times, different stages, people receive information very differently. They'll hear the bit they want to know about now because that's the stage of the recovery they're in. You say the same, the rest of it at the same time a year later, they'll listen to something else because that's what they need to know and understand. And everyone is at different stages, and you've got to be patient, be prepared to invest the time, the resources. It is resource intensive, but where else do you pay out $16 billion in claims and still come out with a bad reputation? I mean, it's just not. So we've got to, if we're given the sums of money involved, I think investing resources and energy and time and really working with people at the grassroots community level, those stakeholders, and we can't do it through government, can't do it through some of the committees and things that were set up. It's got to be face to face with the people on the ground who are representing customers and advocating on their behalf.
Okay. Any questions from the floor? Anybody wants to put at this particular point? Okay. From the email, do more resources need to be committed to communications and public education, or are we just not using our current resources well enough?
I'm sure my communication colleagues would like to hear. I think they should triple their communication department.
That'd be good response, wouldn't it?
I think because the communication tactics and approaches are so varied now, you need to be able to do a lot of different things. And so in order to do that, you need a whole lot of different resources at your command. And as I say, in a crisis, let's call it a reputational crisis like this, there are a whole bunch of things that could have been done, and in order to do that, you need to be resourced up to deliver it.
One of the things I'd say, obviously, with a media engagement involvement and seeing it, and I take David's point because it was a valid one. The silences are incredibly difficult for customers, and obviously intensely frustrating for the media as well. What's your view on this idea of engagement and how constant it should be? Because clearly a lot of people think the idea is that if I say nothing, that shuts the story down and that's the best response. Or if they've said something that I don't agree with, I'd rather not respond because by responding only inflames the situation.
I think you've got to take it on a case-by-case basis, but as a general principle, my belief is you should always front. You should, and thankfully my chief executive, Tim Graft at the time, agreed as well that as much as possible we would comment, because if you don't say anything, you create a vacuum that's going to be filled by somebody else. And it's better that there's a perspective represented on behalf of the industry. I can understand that, it was almost, the industry maybe felt punch drunk at some point, and I've been hit so many times, if I just stand back for a bit, I'm not going to get the next blow. But the reality is that, David made the comment about perhaps being too defensive at times. It's not so much that the industry was defensive from a media perspective, but it just needed to be able to, I think, put its case forward a lot more regularly, engage with media, help them understand. You know, I mean, I was a former journalist. You get thrown into situations where you don't know anything about what's going on, and you try to report it as accurately as you can by working with them to help them understand the realities of your realities as the insurance sector. I think would only help them report better in the future.
Sorry, David.
Well, I just wanted to clarify that while I completely agree, I think, boy, I'm tempted at times, you know, to just ignore the media and maybe they won't go away, but my life will be easier. You know, I was actually talking about the relationship between firms and individual customers, and the silence that set in. I'm really describing a situation where customers repeatedly sought information and couldn't get it. Perhaps because it literally wasn't available at that point. The questions that they were trying to get answered had couldn't be answered at that point. But to me, so that's a very tricky situation to manage. We have to work out how to manage it better than it was. You know, it's. Let me make a related point. I think that communication is a specialist skill. That there will be lots of professional people in the insurance sector, one place or another. Not just the insurers, you know, the builders you hire, the people who are doing physical work, who may be excellent people, but you haven't hired them for their communication skills and they haven't got them. You know? I mean, this is probably a slightly silly illustration, but a very real one. The two builders who ended up building, responsible for rebuilding our place, both came from Scotland. Wonderful guys, loved them greatly. We learned, in particular, never to talk to them on the telephone, because that reduced the number of sentences that we could understand to about 1 and 3. If we were talking, if we wanted to have a serious conversation about what was going on, we needed to talk to somebody else. It's not about the quality of their work. They weren't hired to communicate with the customers. We needed, for a long stage, I really do think people were overwhelmed by the scale of this. So they didn't have the particular resources they needed available for long periods of time. There weren't people available who were able to find things that could be said that were accurate, that didn't simply ended up sounding like you're being fobbed off again.
All right, we've got a couple of minutes and lots of questions just pouring in. I'm sure, unfortunately, we don't think we get to all of them, but I'm just going to pick this one, Samson, for you. From your experience in Christchurch, if insurers wanting to improve trust by consumers in an environment where EQC plays such a pivotal part of the relationship, is it possible? No, it's very challenging, and it always has. I mean, the industry has obviously tried as much as possible to show a united front, perhaps, with EQC in the way that it operates, and that's worked against the industry in some respects, but also, it needed to be done that way. Is it going to recover quickly? No, not in Christchurch. But you're not getting the stories played out nationally in the same way that they have been. There will be ongoing interest in what EQC means for Auckland, obviously, and other places, but the trust levels in Christchurch will take a long, long time to repair. All right, and one more quick one. Do Aucklanders care about perceived insurance issues in Christchurch? Are there regional variations in our industry's reputation, or is the Christchurch experience a national event in terms of industry perceptions?
Christchurch just assumes Auckland doesn't get it. I don't know the answer to that literally, but even if there's a difference in perception, even if there's a better reputation up here, and that'd be great. To me, the important question is, are we confident that we are ready for the Wellington earthquake
Whatever's
fault?
next.
The next big scale, really challenging event, wherever it happens. And I don't know the answer to that. It's a question that is for the sector to think through.
Sure. If I can just add to that, I have a friend in Christchurch who is on the panel show on Radio New Zealand, or used to be. Recently, maybe 3 months ago, he got told, stop talking about the bloody Christchurch earthquakes. So the producer said, no one else wants to hear about Christchurch on this Radio New Zealand program. You see it also at the moment where stories that play out in the press, newspaper in Christchurch aren't getting covered on Stuff, for example. So you're starting to see some of that change in the media, and yes, people are losing interest, but you know, at least Stuff still runs Kim Kardashian stories that might be of interest to Aucklanders.
David.
Can I like one sort of more response? And it really comes from a conclusion that I've got as a result of the big challenge of convincing people that water quality is getting better in Canterbury. So we're not going to debate whether it is or it isn't. Our approach to that simply is the perception will not change until the reality changes. I can't possibly expect to convince people that things are getting better until objectively somebody independent is prepared to affirm that that's the case. To me, the issue is not can the industry or anybody else somehow satisfy the public anguish about the earthquake experience. I would expect the answer to that is no, not until the facts change. Don't worry about chasing the media as though that's the solution to the problem. The facts on the ground have to change, then you've got the raw material to be able to turn the public perception around.
Very good. We'll leave it there. Sorry for some of the questions we didn't get to in the interest of time, but can I ask you to thank our panellists, Samson Samasoni and David Kago. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Give you a gift on the way out too.